Thank you very much, Susan. I'm delighted to be able to welcome all of you to our April talk shop, part of a series of SWET events aimed at sharing the experience and wisdom of other wordsmiths doing things that we do for the sake of helping everyone in the fields, in the professions that we work in, and also serving as a place where people can share and get to know one another, since even before the pandemic, we were all quite isolated and far flung. As you can tell at this meeting, there are people from both hemispheres and north, south, east, and west. So SWET is a wonderfully heterogeneous organization, and we hope to have these events to keep our networking going. So I'm delighted that today we were able to call on Alan Gleason, longtime stalwart of SWET, who helps us out so many times. Alan, as many of you already know, is a veteran professional editor and translator. He edits, translates, and writes for the monthly online magazine Artscape Japan, which if you don't know about, you should. It's easy to find online. And he also works as an editor for the Kate Gaho International Edition and translate books on Japanese art and architecture. And Alan is also known to many of us as a jazz musician, bass player, and also as one of the first translators of manga. So he's really a longtime fixture of SWET, and very glad to have him interviewed today. Another expert on art, someone who has recent experience with Bunkacho related project. So Alan, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Susan, for handling all of the logistics, and thank you especially, Andrew, for joining us and being willing to share your knowledge and experience with us today. It fits right in with SWET, since we're a society of writers, editors, and translators, and this project of yours, the one you've been working on for Bunkacho, involves all of those. As we talked about when we did a small uchiawase last week, I thought I would just start off by asking you to introduce yourself and explain how you came to Japan, how you became involved with art, and particularly contemporary art, which is the main focus of this project that you've been involved in. And then how you came to the project, which is a project of the Bunkacho titled Art Platform, which only, I guess, just got started, maybe 5 years ago? Was that right? 2015?
3 years ago, 2018.
3 years ago, okay. And just came online in March with a huge amount of remarkable material translated into English, mostly post-war art criticism about contemporary Japanese art. So, Andrew, please go ahead and tell us something about your background and then how that led into working on this project.
Yeah, it's great to be here, and I'm really happy to have this chance to speak with everybody. I am indeed a writer, editor, and translator, so I feel quite at home speaking with Lynn and other members of SWET, and I felt really at home, in the other SWET talks that I've participated in as a viewer. So yeah, to give a bit of information about my background, my father was working as a U.S. diplomat, and I was actually raised partly in Japan and China and the U.S. So I always had a connection with Japan. And then during the course of my education in the US, I also had a very strong took a very strong interest in art and literature. And so after going to Columbia University in New York to study comparative literature and society, I was sort of well positioned to then transition into my career as an art writer and editor. And my first real job or major job in that capacity was as the deputy editor of Art Asia Pacific magazine, which is now based in Hong Kong. At the time, it was based in New York. And this was in 2005, 2006, right as the Chinese contemporary art boom was really taking off. It had been building sort of gradually over the past decade prior to that or so. And then there were also kind of new waves of Indian contemporary art and contemporary art from Latin America. So it was a moment when, thanks to international art festivals known as biennales and triennales, the art world was really globalizing like never before. And that was a really important and foundational experience. Of course, Japanese art has a long history of engagement with the US and Europe and with international art in general. And so in the midst of this boom, there was the Takashi Murakami superflat phenomenon. But Japanese art had always had a relatively stable presence, and then all of a sudden it was really in a dramatically short amount of time being overshadowed in Asia by Chinese contemporary art and the emergence of other art scenes around the region, which I'll get to later when I talk more about the context of the art platform project. So it was sort of natural for me to, with my experience having been raised partly in Japan, to be looking at Japan, and with my interest or with my work with Art Asia Pacific, to also be thinking about Japan in a broader context of Asia and the world. As for translation, it's sort of interesting to go back and review sort of how I got into translation. The first translations that I ever did were during a year abroad at Cambridge University in England, where I was studying Tang poetry. And the British system has a kind of unique format of tutorial sessions where you show up and once a week with your tutor, and you're basically doing a one-on-one session or a two-on-one session. It's a very rich sort of form of education. So for the first tutorial that I had upon arriving at Cambridge with my tutor in Tang Dynasty poetry, he just, I showed up to his office and he gave me two photocopies of Tang Dynasty poems. And he said, go translate these and come back next week and show me what you've got. And that was sort of my introduction to translation, where to that point, studying Chinese at Columbia University, even if we were reading a text in Chinese, we always had at least a kind of vocabulary list, some sort of scaffolding that would make it more accessible, but this was kind of being thrown into the deep end. And so I had, in those days, there were not, the first online dictionaries of Chinese and Japanese and English were just coming on board, but I had to sit there with a paper Chinese dictionary and look up radicals, look up stroke counts, and sort of go through each line of poetry and basically look up every single character and then put together something that I thought could be a translation. And that was, again, also a very formative experience for my approach to translation, which was that, why not look up every word? Don't assume that you know how a word is being used in that context. And also, I think, one thing that I'll get to later, but working with Chinese writing as opposed to Japanese writing. In Chinese, you have Chinese characters, a kanji, that are all, there's nothing aside from kanji, whereas in Japanese writing, you have kanji mixed with kana. And so having that experience in reading Chinese, I think, has also made me more attuned to the role of kana in Japanese. And when we talk about kana in Japanese, we're of course talking about particles and katsuyo, conjugations of verbs. So that's something that, in a sort of positive negative relationship, my experience with Chinese has really informed my approach to Japanese translation. So I sort of had this early experience with translation, and then my entry into Japanese translation proper was just through having artists who were friends asked me to translate a statement for them. Someone asked me to translate a press release for them, and gradually building up a practice through these very concrete tasks that, were basically, coming to me just because I happened to be there. But again, I think after I had developed a certain amount of experience, then I was really interested in building on that. And with my background as an editor, of course, coming up with an approach that I could draw on, so that I could sort of produce more consistent results, along with just the experience of working with people. Also, being very open to dialogue with the writers and other people who might be working on the translation. That has really informed my translation practice, and that has in turn informed the guidelines for translation that I introduced to the Art Platform project.
I see. Yeah, I was going to say, looking through the guidelines, the style guide, which you might want to put up, or maybe we can share later on. I was, as someone who translates a lot of art related material, but has never ever seen or put together a style guide specifically geared to art translation, I was intrigued by such topics as akubun, these agrammatical, sometimes seemingly nonsensical, non-sentence sentences that don't have a clear subject or change subject, and appear very often in the writings of artists, and how to finesse those. This is a sort of an aside, and maybe something we can go into later, but having a document like that with guidelines for those sorts of oddities is certainly useful. Can you explain to us how you wound up back in Japan and how you became involved with this particular project, the Art Platform project?
Right. So I had been working in New York at Art Asia Pacific magazine, and I basically moved back to Japan for personal reasons. I, started a family, and my wife has a business here. She runs a gallery called Takininagawa Gallery, which does Japanese contemporary art. And so it seemed, more practical to sort of center the family on the gallery business rather than writing and editing, which could be done anywhere. But after moving to Japan, I started freelancing for the Japan Times and contributing to international publications such as Frieze and Art Forum, as well as Art in Australia. And so, yeah, that was sort of how I got into the Japanese art scene. And then I was, basically the Bunkacho side, when they started doing prep work on the Art Platform project. They were doing hearings with different people, so I did a hearing with them, and I kind of gave them ideas about, different approaches to promoting Japanese contemporary art in an international context, and that sort of led them, I guess, in turn to invite me to join the steering committee of what became the Art Platform project. So there's a committee called Contemporary Art Committee to Japan, which is chaired by Mami Kataoka, who's the director of the Mori Art Museum. The co-chair, or I forget what, the vice chair is Yuka Uematsu, who is now the chief curator at the National Museum of Art in Osaka. And there are other art professionals, not limited to curators. There are also art organizers and different types of art professionals who are involved in the committee. And so we first convened as a committee in late 2018, say September 2018, and that was kind of really the launch of the Art Platform project. And so, as I mentioned, I think, you know, there was a big moment of transition entering the 21st century, where Chinese contemporary art was sort of really expanding quickly. There were the emergence of new art scenes around the region and beyond. And also, you know, around 2009, there was a new art fair established in Hong Kong that went on to become Art Basel Hong Kong. And that sort of cemented Hong Kong as a regional / global art market center that could connect with mainland China and also Southeast Asia, and then, you know, a kind of global art scene. So with all of these different shifts happening in the art scene, I think the Bunkacho and also the members of the Contemporary Art Committee Japan were very aware that while Japan is, or Japanese contemporary art to be specific, it always has a certain cachet with international audiences, we could be doing more to promote Japanese contemporary art, or rather, you know, if we don't put more effort in, we would be left behind, let's say. That's one thing. And then the other thing is, you know, I think there was a sense that the discourse on Japanese post-war and contemporary art had largely been shaped in the international arena by international researchers and curators, and that, you know, there wasn't as much of a voice for Japanese professionals in the international arena as one would hope. So, you know, there's a pioneering art group called the Gutai Art Association, which was based in Asia and active in the 1950s through to the early 1970s. And sort of the Gutai group was, as it were, rediscovered in the international art market, and in a sense, you know, although you know, better or higher evaluation for the work of Gutai benefits everybody, there was a sense that this was something that had been sort of cornered by the international art scene before the Japanese art scene had a chance to sort of, you know, put its own stamp on it. There's another phenomenon called monoha, which emerged at the end of the 1960s, and sort of it never coalesced into a formal group as such, but it was something that was bubbling around in Japan for a good decade or so after that, and that was also around 2012, 2013, sort of rediscovered in the international art scene. So I think, you know, one of the motivations for the art platform project is you know, trying to promote Japanese contemporary art in a new global context, one that has radically changed from you know, what people might have been familiar with at the end of the 20th century. And then the other issue is trying to make sure that Japanese voices are included in the international conversation. So I can start screen sharing and show everyone the site.
Let me just ask one follow-up question regarding the origins of the project. The motivations are clear, and maybe the perceived needs for it. But where did that impetus come from? Was it people inside Bunkacho of their own accord, I don't know, saw a sort of artistic version of the Chinese threat or something? Or was it from art related? Was it from curators and art museum directors coming to the Bunkacho and saying this is something that needs to be done? How did it originate, actually?
I'm not 100% sure about the, you know, that origin, but there is a group of people in the Bunkacho within Bunkacho who are definitely taking an active role in building this project. and obviously with bureaucratic situation in Japan, there's no guarantee how long how far they could push it. But for the time being, there's sort of support across multiple levels of the bunkacho for the project, or for the project. I would say not just the art platform project, but for the project of having the bunkacho commit further to Japanese contemporary art, because Japanese contemporary art had not really been a focus of the bunkacho to that point. Yeah, and then of course there's the Japan Foundation, which is, I'm not sure what the exact wording for it would be, but it's supported by the, I think, Ministry of Foreign Affairs without being an actual government body. So it's sort of a quasi governmental body, which has a very specific mission of promoting Japanese culture abroad, and then it will sometimes bring projects back to Japan. But Japan Foundation is very outward oriented, and it's also, again, not looking not just at contemporary art, but also language and literature and film and other aspects of culture. But I think there was a sense that whereas Japan Foundation had to always be, it sort of always has to have an anchor outside of Japan somewhere. And whereas the Bunkacho project could sort of maybe be a bit more flexible in that sense. It wouldn't necessarily have to have an anchor outside of Japan. I should also say, by the way, that I was a member of the Contemporary Art Committee Japan for the past 3 years, and then editorial director of the translation project over the past year plus. But I've since stepped away from both the committee and the translation project, or overseeing the translation project. So I'm sort of speaking more as an individual rather than as a representative of the project as such. Yeah, but yeah. But yeah, so I think the art platform project has a multi-prong approach. One of the important, we're looking at the website right now, one of the important sort of initiatives that is at the core of Art Platform Japan is actually a collection search. So it's a database or more like an aggregator of works that are in Japanese museum collections. There's also a translation project, and then there are exchange programs, or basically workshops and symposiums that are organized for international and Japanese curators. But so the collection search is really important. We ended up calling it Shuzo as a nickname, which refers both to sort of the act of collecting, as well as to a number of figures across Japanese modern and contemporary art history, such as Takiguchi Shuzo, who was a very important critic and curator, active actually from even before the World War II era. But yeah, so this is something where Japanese museums have really important holdings of Japanese and international modern and contemporary art, but the information is not necessarily accessible to people who are not already somehow connected to the museum. And so establishing a collection search tool is one way that we can sort of make the museum collections more transparent, more accessible, and in turn encourage international curators to include Japanese modern and contemporary art in their exhibitions. So you can. This is still obviously in a beta version, there's a lot more refining to do, but you can type in, for example, Yayoi Kusama, and you'll get a number of, well, 147 artworks from across multiple museums. So here we see at the top of the screen, Saku Municipal Museum of Modern Art, Toyota Municipal Museum of Modern Art, Niigata City Art Museum. And if you were to say sort by date, that's quite useful if you're an art history researcher, or you're a curator trying to organize a show of historical works. We see here this work called Toy Firework from 1952, which is very early in Kusama's career. And you can click on it and find out some basic details as well as where it's held. So this is like a really important sort of first step towards better integrating Japanese museums with the international art scene. You know, I think, for example, if you were to check out the Smithsonian website in the US, the collection is searchable, and there are a lot of times there will be thumbnails or even quite significant images of the works. And so it just really helps people who want to do research on a certain topic to kind of know that if they go to the Smithsonian website and they start looking for things, they can, you know, not just find basic details, but get a pretty good idea of what they're looking at. The Museum of Modern Art in New York also has a searchable collection database. And that's something that's been missing from individual museum collections here in Japan. So this aggregator or database is sort of at least one step that we can do to create more horizontal connections. The programs, for example, over the past year, in response to the coronavirus pandemic, we organized a series of webinars that were addressing topics such as global promotion and international exchange in the arts after COVID-19. So we had the director of Goethe Institute Tokyo, someone from Creative New Zealand, someone from the British Council, joining Mami Kataoka in a discussion about sort of how you know, cultural and exchange programs could adapt in response to the pandemic. I did a talk with 3 artists, Jibesh Bagchi, Ho Zunien, and Hito Styrel, who are all based in different parts of the world. Jibesh is based in Delhi, Zunien is based in Singapore, and Hito is based in Berlin. And we were sort of talking about how the pandemic might affect critical artistic practices for contemporary artists. And then finally, we have the texts project. So the idea with the text is to translate 100 important texts from across modern and contemporary Japanese art history. This was something that was sort of put on the table in 2018 with the first meetings of the Contemporary Art Committee Japan. And we set up a translation working group to begin thinking about different approaches to organizing a major translation project. I would say what really kicked things into gear for us was the controversy at the Aichi Triennale 2019. I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but works. There was a display of works at the Aichi Triennale that featured references to the comfort woman issue, and also used the image of the Showa emperor. So there was one work that where the artist was burning pieces of paper that had images of, they were not in fact a piece of paper, I think they were in fact prints of his own work that included images of the Showa emperor. And this became a huge aggravation to right-wing extremists, and the Triennale was inundated with harassing phone calls and terroristic threats, and the display ended up being shut down. And then there was a huge outcry from the art scene, and eventually the display was reopened. But I think, for one thing, in response to the controversy, 2 members of the translation working group ended up quitting in protest from the Contemporary Art Committee. And then I think for the remaining members, there were 3 of us who were left. We felt it really crystallized the need to come up with a structure that could not just recreate a canon or canonical values of Japanese modern and contemporary art, but that could apply a critical perspective to this translation project. And so that pushed us toward coming up with a group of themes for guiding the selection process. So the sort of loose goal of the project is to translate 100 texts. We came up with 7 themes so far, with the idea that each theme would basically cover about 10 texts. And then, you know, at a later point, there would be the option of adding another theme, or maybe expanding the number of texts in these themes. But so the themes that we have so far are collectivism, critics, exhibition histories, feminism in/and Japanese art, Japan, Asia, photography and media, and state and ecology. So I think these themes, obviously something like feminism in and Japanese art relates to viewpoints or voices that tend to get overlooked in canonical narratives. State and ecology is basically, the idea is sort of looking at how the state interacts with the ecology for art in Japan. So a lot of the texts in state and ecology do refer obliquely to the Aichi Triennale controversy, even though some of them were written decades before the event. So we came up with the themes. We then approached various academics and specialists and asked them to provide recommend texts for each theme. So for collectivism, I think we approached about 3 people, and each person submitted 30 recommendations or so. And then we have a selection team that chooses texts from among those recommendations. So we actually were reading 100 texts at a time, and then kind of debating them and whittling them down to a selection. And sometimes also, as part of the selection process, we would then come up with ideas for alternate texts. Another structural thing guiding the selections is that we committed to having a minimum of 3 out of 10 texts in each theme would be written by female authors. And that is, compared to other countries, that's not a great ratio of gender balance, but for one thing, if you throw in a theme like feminism in and Japanese art, where presumably most of the writers would be women, then it actually works out to a more acceptable, 4:6 ratio. But that was something that was important, I think, for the critical thrust of the project, and we've actually had to push ourselves. For example, collectivism, for whatever reason, happens to be a male-dominated theme, and so we've really had to push ourselves to look for alternate voices so we could represent female voices, and I think in the end that's been very generative. It's kind of helped us to definitely expand the horizons of the project. And we now have about 30 texts that have been selected with, say, 20 translations that are either finished or underway right now.
Andrew, I have a quick question, which is about as far as the selection process goes, did you and the committee have a free hand? Was Bunkacho itself making any efforts to steer choices or anything of that sort? Just curious.
Right. No, we pretty much had a free hand. After we finalize the selection, I think the Bunkacho people read the text and sign off on it. But that hasn't been, they haven't pushed back on a selection so far. There were, I think, so yeah, it's been fine, and I'm hopeful that it would continue to be that way. I didn't get an indication that there would be a change in approach. Yeah.
You can go on if you want. At some point, it would be good we'd certainly like to hear about the nuts and bolts of how you set up the process of translating and editing these texts. But if there's some other material you want to present about the site itself, go ahead.
No, I think that's good. I'll show you. Here are some of the texts that we came up with, or that we have translated so far. So anyone who's interested later can check out the site and read the texts. I think maybe I'll get into the approach to translation first, though, because thinking about the project, one thing that I realized as I was, taking over more and more responsibility for the translation project was that we did need some kind of guideline to structure the translations, and that we also needed to kind of be attentive to the demands, the specific demands of art translation or translating art writing. And I think, there are obviously many different types of translation. We have something like catch copy, corporate catch copy, where a lot of leeway would be given for language use. So you have maybe the slogan or the logo of a Japanese company doesn't necessarily translate to an Indonesian context or a North American context, and so you have to do localization and come up with something that works for that specific milieu. You have poetry translation, which has severe formal constraints. You have what do you call them, subtitles for films, which also have kind of formal constraints. With art translation, or with art criticism translation, I think one thing is that it's prose, so there are not necessarily formal constraints as such, the way that there would be with poetry or subtitles. But basically, it's not literature either, and I think we have to acknowledge that criticism or critical writing is really turns on rhetoric and argument and logical connections. So that was something that I wanted to stress in the style guide, was making sure that translators are being attentive to rhetoric and argument, which in the end, it really means paying attention to conjunctions and turns of phrase, how language is being used in a rhetorical way. The other thing is, of course, with art translation or art criticism, that writers are often looking at physical objects and observing them and describing them. And so we also have to be very attentive to physical relationships in the text. So if something is above or below, if something is in front or behind, volume, size, mass, as well as things like singular or plural. These all make a big difference in how effectively we can translate art writing. The other thing that distinguishes this project is that we're mainly working with historical texts. So if you see on the screen here, we have a Thesis on Capitalist Realism was written in 1964. Contemporary Artist Minority, A New Catalyst for the Community, was written in 2001. The Origins of Goshinye was written in 1988. When we're dealing with historical texts, one of the things is that there's a sort of pickling effect where the information becomes a lot denser than what it would have been if you were reading the text in the moment of its being published. So there are a lot of references within any text that might not be self-evident to a reader 40 years after the fact. And that is sort of a difference. I like to call it as a difference between referentiality and informationality. So if you're translating a press release, you know that the point of the press release is to communicate information about the event, and that kind of guides your translation strategy. It helps you to process information. With a historical text that is more governed by referentiality, you have to spend a little more time researching context and doing a lot of legwork, looking through references or looking through other texts. So yeah, I mean, I think the other aspect of referentiality is that these are, in a sense, intertexts or metatexts that connect through to whole universes of writing. In fact, this text at the top of the screen, Post-war avant-garde art movements and women artists, 1950s to 60s, is basically an overview of how women were treated in Japanese art criticism of the 1950s and 60s. So basically, the narrative, such as it is of this essay, is constructed around quotes from other people's writing. And in order to get the translation right, we ended up, looking up all of the quoted material as well, and trying to figure out how language is being used in those contexts before they were then quoted in the author's text. So those are some of the challenges of historical texts, along with the fact that a lot of times there is no author to consult. The author may be no longer living, or sometimes the author simply isn't interested in sort of taking an active role in the translation project, because they wrote the text 3 decades ago and they don't really remember so well. And then I think the other thing in general, which applies to not just art writing, but to a lot of critical writing in Japan, is that there are different approaches to fact checking between Japanese writing and English writing. And so we really have to do a fact check of every text, a thorough fact check of every text as we're translating it, because there are sometimes wrong dates or wrong names, or things that have not really been checked at the time that the texts were being written and published. And within that, as Alan mentioned, there's this issue with akubun. So Japanese art writing in particular is not generally edited, so strictly for style and usage, and so there tends to be in any given text, a couple sentences that are just very convoluted. The teni oha is kind of strange, and you have to piece through that bit by bit. So that's kind of, in a sense, a lot to handle for one person, and we decided that the best approach would be to have a team-based translation process for these translations. So we ended up basically putting together teams of a translator, a native Japanese speaker who does a cross-check, and then a native English bilingual editor who also works on refining the wording and fact-checking. And so that was quite an achievement, I would say, in terms of securing a commitment on the part of Bunkacho, or more specifically, the National Arts Center Tokyo is sort of the host organization for Art Platform Japan, to set out money not just for the translation as such, but also for the cross-checking and editing process.
A question about that, just what you just mentioned about the team. You mentioned a bilingual editor, which seems like a good idea. Does that mean that the editors were also expected to be capable of checking back against the Japanese text if need be? So
Yeah.
that way this would be probably not redundant to, but it would supplement what the cross-checker was also doing, right?
Yeah, and I think there's a, say, a Japanese mind and an English mind, and there are parts where they intersect. If you happen to, regardless of whether you're a native English speaker or not, if you know English to a certain degree, you would have a shared sensibility with any other English speaker. But there are also parts where, when we're talking about translation, they're just different, I don't know, affinities or sensitivities. I found that depend on whether someone is a native of one language or the other. So having both, viewpoints intersect through the translation really helps. But it's kind of up to the editor as to what extent to get involved with the source text that the translator has prepared. But yeah, I found that sometimes there are sentences in the translation that, for whatever reason, they don't come together as English. The English syntax is off.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you have the choice of either continuing to edit that sentence as English, in which case you could end up getting quite far away from the source text, or you can go back to the source text and see if there's not, some other way of organizing that sentence so that it, you would essentially edit the English in reference to the Japanese. Yeah. I'll just introduce the style guide here. I compiled the style guide, but I received a lot of guidance from Reiko Tomi, who's a pioneering translator of Japanese art history, or Japanese post-war art history. She's sort of single-handedly helped to build the field of Japanese art history translation and editing, and then also Meg Taylor, who is a member of SWET, also both of them provided me style guides that they had put together for previous projects, and both spend a lot of time sharing ideas about how to approach art writing. And Meg in particular worked on a project called the Canadian Online Art Book Project, which is sponsored by an organization called Art Canada Institute. So although Meg is not a Japanese to English translator as such, she did have this interesting alternative bilingual project that she had worked on, and that was really interesting to have as a resource. The other names that you see listed here are people who reviewed the style guide and gave feedback as well. But yeah, so I think one of the things that was important with the style guide was to kind of list our translation principles. I won't necessarily go into detail here, but some of the important principles that I wanted translators to focus on were supplementing subjects and objects. So you have, a common issue in Japanese to English translation is that you have a sentence such as ikimasu, which doesn't have a subject or doesn't have an explicit subject, and it doesn't have an explicit object. And then, if you were to translate that sentence ikimasu, you would have to supplement the subject. Perhaps it would be I will go, and you could even have a sentence ikimasu where, based on context, you would know that there's an object as well. I will go to school. So that's something with art translation that is very important, because we're talking about making processes a lot of the time, or we're talking about viewing processes a lot of the time. So, if you have a sentence that doesn't have an explicit subject, but it's clear that somebody is making something, then you want to have that subject present, and you want to have the verb in an active voice, so that we know that this is somebody making something and not it is being made, which is kind of, not really what the sentence is talking about. Another sort of important principle for me with art translation is foreign, not foreign. This is my word for, or my term for, asking translators to be open to a defamiliarization of both their English knowledge and their Japanese knowledge through the translation process. So one thing that comes up in art translation a lot is the suffix sei. So you have a word like shizensei, and a lot of people will naturally tend to translate that as natural character. But since art is heavily influenced by philosophy, and art is also about a sort of iterative making process, I want people to kind of be aware that English actually has a number of tools for also reflecting that suffix "se." For example, we have "ness," so you could come up with nature-ness. We have "iti" as in politicality, so you could say naturality. We have "hood" as in objecthood, so you could say naturehood. And all of those words might initially seem a little odd or off or foreign when you try them out the first time. But in fact, there are many people writing in English as native, not necessarily native, but people writing in English who use the language in that way. And this is kind of important for communicating sort of the author's thought process, that they're not just sort of lining up words that already exist, but they're also creating new terms in order to express their ideas. And then the other thing that I really have been stressing is fact checking again. So looking at each text critically and sort of trying to understand where the author might have missed a date or something. And there are a number of texts that I referred to in putting together the style guide. For example, Yoko Hasegawa's Routledge course in Japanese translation is a great book for thinking through some of these problems. Jay Rubin's Making Sense of Japanese. He dedicates the first chapter, I think, of his book to the idea of supplementing subjects and objects. There's also Burton Raffel's Art of Translating Prose, which is not about Japanese specifically, but it goes into the importance of looking at syntax in translating prose. Lawrence Venuti's The Translator's Invisibility is a theoretical text that also informed the style guide to some extent, which is apparent in the foreign, not foreign. So Venuti is kind of interested in getting people to be more open to foreignizing translation over naturalizing translation, where in Venuti's idea, you would embrace some of those unusual turns of phrase rather than paraphrasing them into something that might seem more natural in English, but which somehow forecloses the expression of the text.
Sorry to interrupt, and this might be the only time I have to interrupt you. We're probably getting on to a good time to take a break. Shall we take it now, or would you like to say a couple more things? Is there a better point for temporary closure or not?
I just wanted to introduce one other book, since it's a SWET member, Judy Wakabayashi's translating Japanese English translation. I wasn't able to reference the book as I was putting together the style guide because it was just published earlier this year. But that's another book that I think is very interesting for people to look at in sort of putting together their own translation practices. Yeah, so now's a good time for a break. I think at this point we might look at an actual text. I have it queued up here, so I'll just jump there. This is a text that we ended up translating as Sayonara Yomiuri Independent by the critic Tono Yoshiaki. So the Japanese title is Sayonara Yomiuri Independent. I forget if it's the Independent 10 or if it's just Independent, but that was sort of an interesting translatorial, Sayonara Yomiuri Independent. So that was an interesting transitorial circuitous process where we started with the Japanese title and then came up with a bunch of English titles such as Farewell Yomiuri Independent, Goodbye Yomiuri Independent, So Long Yomiuri Independent, and then I realized, Sayonara works in English as well. So That's the title we ended up going with. Yeah, this is, I just wanted to bring this up as sort of an example of sort of some of the issues I was talking about. And we see already on this title page, there is a kind of gray text, which is the editorial deck copy that was presumably written by the editors of Bijutsu Techo, which is the magazine where this article first appeared. May have been written by the author himself. It's sort of hard to tell. We decided to include this in the translation. So there's already, just right off the bat, there's a question of whether this is something that should be translated or not. On top of that, the Yomiuri Underpandan exhibition was first held in 1949. And in this deck copy, we begin with a sentence which I've translated as a source of so much excitement since 1948. The Yomiuri Underpandan is no more. So the deck copy sort of sets the origins of the Yomiuri Underpandan in 1948 as opposed to 1949. And that was something where, all of a sudden, my first reaction was like, okay, typical Japanese art publication, not fact-checking. We need to change this to 1949. But after doing more research, into the Yomiuri Underpandan and looking back at some of the critical writing in both English and Japanese about the Yomiuri Underpandan, I found out that there was controversy when the Yomiuri Shimbun announced they would be launching a new exhibition in 1948. And so that's some of these things where, I think being patient with the fact-checking process and maybe fact-checking your own fact-checking can help to tease things out. So we ended up leaving 1948 in the text and then adding a footnote to explain the context. But this text is written by one of the major critics of the time, Tono Yoshiaki, and it's reviewing one of the major exhibitions of the time, the Yomiuri Underpandan 10. So the exhibition started in 1949. It ran until 1963, and then just before the 1964 edition, the Yomiuri Shimbun announced that it would be discontinued. And so during that 15-year period, or say 14-year period, when the exhibition was active, it had become it grew into the epicenter of sort of Japanese avant-garde art. It was held every year in February or March at the Metropolitan Museum in Tokyo. It was an open call or a free exhibition, so anybody could participate, and it was unjuried. So, there was no particular hierarchy among the works, and this was in contrast to exhibitions organized by associations where there was sort of more of a kind of coterie feel to the exhibitions. So by entering the 1960s, certainly 1960, 61, 62, 63, the Underpandan exhibition had become the epicenter of anti-art practices, and there were sort of quite outlandish works and performances being shown, and that resulted first in 1962, or after the 1962 edition, with the announcement of new exhibition rules for what kind of works could be submitted. And then after the 1963 edition, it resulted in the discontinuation of the exhibition altogether. But so, yeah, you have a major critic reviewing a major event. And so this translation was not just about looking at the words on the page in front of you and then converting them from Japanese into English, but also looking at all the different texts that were intersecting with this text. And so this issue with the 1948 or 1949 is one example. A very simple, thing that comes at the start of the text is that Tono makes references to Shinnen, the New Year, when he's talking about the independent exhibition. And so, of course, I think most translators would understand that this is more of an idiom in reference to spring as opposed to the actual New Year. But if you know that the Yomiuri Independent Exhibition was held every year in late February or early March, then you would kind of be able to confirm that he is in fact using this language idiomatically. And so this translation ended up being quite heavily annotated. Pretty much almost every sentence sort of referred back to some text that Tono had written somewhere. So there's a sentence here where Tono is reflecting on, reminiscing on his experience visiting the Yomiuri Independent. And he talks about meeting Shusaku Arakawa, standing entranced by Tetsumi Kudo's anemone-like vinyl sculpture, laughing at Ushio Shinohara's mohawk hairstyle, and being struck by Okamoto Shinjiro's Marilyn Monroe picture, Death of an Actress. And so pretty much every one of these things that seem like an aside, if you're just looking at the text as a gembun, are actually referencing articles that he wrote about these artists in the context of the independent exhibition. And the Tetsumi Kudo sentence is kind of notable in that regard because each year a bunch of critics would be commissioned to visit the independent exhibition and then spotlight individual works for the front page of the Yomiuri Shimbun. So there would be, say, 5 or 6 critics, and each critic would do one work by one artist. And in 1960, Tono wrote about Kudo's work, and he referred to it as Garakta no Han Geijutsu, so junk anti-art. And this article then introduced that terminology into the discourse of the time. And so people were, from that point on, were very concerned about, what is anti-art? How do we define anti-art? Is it something that can stand on its own, or is anti-art necessarily dependent on a pre-existing concept of art? But so that's something where this very, sort of aside-like mention of something actually, if you tease it out a little bit, it has a historical resonance. And so, I added a footnote where I mention what I mentioned just now. I gave some more context about this famous article. Yes, the footnotes are quite substantial, but I think in some cases they're warranted. Not every translation in the Art Platform project necessarily has this level of annotation. But one other thing that I wanted to introduce here is another seemingly innocuous reference that Tono makes to a different artist. Here we have Tono quoting the regulations or the rules that the museum implemented following the 1962 edition of the Yomiuri Independent. So 1 works with devices that emit irritating or high-pitched sound. 2 works employing materials that may give off foul odors or rot. 3 works incorporating bladed implements and the like that may pose a safety hazard. 4 works that may contravene public health statutes, as with works that demonstrably give offense to viewers. 5 works that place gravel, sand, and the like directly on the floor, or which employ materials that may damage/soil the floor. 6 works suspended directly from the ceiling. All of these works have essentially been prohibited. Tono then goes through and he tries to sort of pick apart these regulations, and he mentions an artist called Hiroko Hiraoka. So he says, when you stood before Hiroko Hiraoka's concentric circles at the 1962 edition, a tape recorder would emit beautiful concrete sounds. And the Japanese reads, Hiraoka Hiroko no doushien no mae ni tatsu to tape recorder ga utsukushii gutai on hashita. So again, this is just a kind of very straightforward sentence that implies a sort of relationship of causality with standing in front of the work and then having a sound be emitted by a tape recorder. The doushien is a little confusing at first, but there happens to be an illustration of the work in the article, which shows it to be a kind of painting-like work depicting concentric circles. But I was sort of intrigued by this reference, and I just wanted to, again, as a kind of proper fact-checking process, understand a bit more about what the context for this line was. And one of the interesting things about Hiraoka Hiroko is that she had started off as an avant-garde artist as part of the group Neo-Dadaism organizers, and she was relatively successful or enjoying critical attention up until the 1962 Yomiuri Independent exhibition. She had been profiled earlier that year in the Yomiuri Shimbun, but she ended up moving to New York as the wife of the conceptual artist On Kawara. And upon moving to New York, she gave up her artistic career, got a job, and supported Kawara's career for the rest of her life, more or less. So it was important to me to sort of bring this reference to life, partly because I felt this is an example of how the translation process can exactly bring history back to life and bring historical figures back to life. So I was already kind of curious about what was happening, and then through the editorial process, a professor at UCLA, William Marotti, reviewed the translation, and he mentioned, or he thought it was noteworthy that this was the same year that an artist called Tone Yasunao submitted a work called Tape Recorder to the Yomiuri Independent. And Tone's work is much more famous as a kind of pioneering piece of sound art. So, all of a sudden we're thinking, is the tape recorder reference in this sentence actually referring to Tone's work, Hiraoka's work in the image? It looks like it's just a painting. So is it maybe that Tone's work happened to be placed near Hiraoka's work, and somehow Tono could hear Tone's work when he stood in front of Hiraoka's work? And so that ended up taking us on a bit of an odyssey to track down references to the work, and we ended up finding a spotlight text that Tono had written about Hiraoka for the Yomiuri Shimbun. And in this text, Tono describes how, in fact, Hiraoka and Tone had collaborated on a performance piece earlier that year at an exhibition that Hiraoka held at, I think it's Tokyo Gallery. I forget exactly which gallery it is. And then later on, he gives a more complete description of the work, where he states unequivocally that the sound element was indeed coming from Hiraoka's work. So yeah, I think that's important to just show how a sort of critical fact-checking mentality can actually do a lot to bring a text to life. So once we knew that the sound was indeed coming from Hiraoka's work, it just settled the translation. So I don't think the wording changed so much over the course of the different drafts, but it was just, we could say it with conviction, as it were, that, when you stood in front of Hiraoka's concentric circles, a tape recorder would emit concrete sounds. So that's a lot of the legwork that goes into translations. And I just wanted to show everybody now one of the working drafts of this translation. So I was the translator. A researcher called Uesaki Sen was the cross-checker, and then William Marathi was the bilingual editor. So this is a view of Uesaki-san's cross-check edit. I sent him the text, he inputs notes, and then we put it up on Google Docs and do a workshop together. So the green text is sort of text that we've decided on together in the process of the workshop. But one format that we came up with for doing these cross-checking and editing processes was to make a table with the Japanese and the English side by side, which makes it just easier to do a quick reference while also being able to look at the text. I think something that I've commonly seen is that you would have a bunch of Japanese text on top and then a bunch of English text on bottom for each paragraph, say. But that sort of has its own pitfalls, and having the text side by side, you can just kind of read the English as a single flow, but you can also then refer back to the Japanese. Another thing that was really important for this project is using the comments section or the comments function feature to communicate with other members of the team. So the first sentence of this translation in Japanese reads, Yomiuri Under Pandan-tenが昨年の第15回を最後に今年から中止になった。And I found, like, if I try to do a more or less word for word translation of the Japanese, you have sakunen and kotoshi, and so you have last year and this year repeating, and I was a little iffy about that. So I was looking for alternate readings, and one of them that I came up with was the Yomiuri Under Pandan exhibition was discontinued this year, making the previous 15th edition its last. So that was a way of avoiding the redundancy of this year, last year. But I went ahead and came up with two other alternate readings that I then shared with the translation team, and people could offer their feedback. Or we look at alternate word choices together. So this is a junjoha in the genbun. I think the first word that I came up with was purist, and then the cross-checker thought that didn't quite capture junjoha, and so we came up with some other options like traditionalist or classicist. And then during the revision process, I think I forget which one I ended up going with at this point, but I would sort of take a look at it again and finalize something. Yeah, so I think that's about it, really, in terms of presentation. I'm happy to go back to any of the materials if people want to look at it more.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I have a little bit of just a little follow-up about the where that project will be going from this point on. We have at least one question from John McCreary about how contemporary art is defined. But if you can, we can hold on that for just a second, and then also open the floor to any other questions. I noticed on the art platform site that they say this will go on until March 2023. So 2 years precisely from when it was officially opened with this large number of translated articles on March 15 this year. What does that mean? Are they going to review it after 2 years? Is there some result that they're looking for? What's the deal?
Right. So the art platform project was established from the start as a 5-year project. So it had a sort of time limit built into it. But I think there is the option for extending it, in some form, which is sort of more up to the, I think, Bunkacho side. Yeah, they could maybe continue indefinitely in its current form, and it could become even more formalized as a sort of institution, say. I think those are both options out there.
I see. They say in the original manifesto that, and you mentioned also that one of maybe the major reason for this project is to give more exposure to Japanese contemporary art overseas, as well as providing access to art criticism and history written by Japanese writers rather than those overseas that have looked at it and written about it in English. But is there any actual mechanism in effect to getting this project known overseas? Is there any active outreach taking place? We know from many of our own experiences that a lot of these very ambitious projects in Japan, the ball is sort of dropped when it comes to the actual process of getting it known outside the country.
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, we have a built-in network of international curators who have come to Japan for the workshops and seminars that we've hosted over the past 2 years. So we held our first symposium in March 2019, and we held a second symposium in late November 2019, and then we held our webinar series across several months of 2020. So those are relatively small numbers, but nevertheless sort of more influential people who are already interested in Japan and are working in international institutions. Just to throw out a name, there's Ruben Kihan, is a curator at the Gallery of Modern Art, Queensland Art Gallery of Modern Art in Brisbane, Australia. And he's someone who's been very engaged with Japanese contemporary art and Japanese art history, while also looking at broader, art practices in the East Asia and Southeast Asia and the world. So he's someone who could potentially help us to promote the project to other audiences. And then, I think the project team are also sort of actively trying to court publications like the Japan Times, for example, and those further afield as well. But it is a challenge to get the attention of a mainstream US or American publication like Artforum, for example. I don't know if we're showing up on their radar so much, and that's also, I think, indicative of the very context that the art platform project is attempting to redress, which is that maybe Japan doesn't have as quite the cachet as it used to have. But on the other hand, I think if we take a step back and sort of look at everything in perspective, it's also probably just a whole lot healthier for international art to have many more voices, so that we should welcome more coverage for Chinese contemporary art. We should welcome more coverage for Indonesian contemporary art, and we should welcome Japanese art sort of being in conversation with those different art scenes.
Certainly, yeah. What about you were saying that you stepped away from your role up till this month in terms of being the editorial director and in charge of the translation project. Are you still involved in some way with this project overall? And if not, who is your successor, and is the translation project itself still ongoing?
The translation project is ongoing. I have stepped away from overseeing the translations, but I will continue to contribute as a translator. And in fact, I've taken on a very big assignment, which is working on the translation of a book called Nikutai no Anarchism. Anarchism of the Flesh, I think is the current English translation. But this is a very important text or book that was written by a researcher called Kuroda Raiji, a researcher and curator. He's a curator at the Fukuoka Asia Bijutsukan. I'm blanking on the English name right now.
Asian Art Museum.
Yeah.
Maybe the only one in Japan, actually.
Yeah. So that museum has been very influential in pushing forward research on art in Asia. But this book is Kuroda-san's. It's like, I think there are maybe 600 pages of body copy, another like 200 pages of note, and then 100 pages of chronology, nempu, in the back of the book. And so we've had a literal team of translators working on different parts of the book over the past couple of years. There have been 2 translators that are working on the nempu. And then there was another translator who was working on the body copy already, but we decided to split up the body copy among myself and a third translator, just to keep the ball rolling. So it's like a really substantial project.
Just to be clear, now is that part of the this project we've been talking about, or is that something else? Does that mean that the project, the Bunkacho, is also funding book-length translations, not only the article-size ones that are on the site?
The idea originally was to have both book length and articles being translated, but I think in the excitement of being given a budget to commission books, the translation team, the translation working group that was responsible for commissioning the Kuroda book, which I was included in, sort of went straight for Everest, whereas we might have, taken more time to think about practicality of length and complexity. I think Kuroda has a very accessible writing style, so it's not necessarily that it's abstruse or anything like that. It's just like a very voluminous treatment of anti-art performance.
Wow.
in post-war Japan.
Are there other books in the hopper, or is that
Yeah, well, so that was already on terms of length and commitment. That was a big sort of commitment. But the other thing is that with the pandemic, the publishing industry has been just sort of really knocked on its back heel, and so if we were to translate a book, we were not really sure that we could find a publisher in the US or Europe who is willing to take it on board and get it to print and distribution. One thing about Japanese government projects, I think not just the bunkacho, also metropolitan or municipal level projects as well, is that they don't have a mechanism for processing income that is earned from products such as books. So the idea of creating a bunkacho imprint through which we could publish our own copy of Nikutai no Anarchism is not something that's available to us because of regulations on how finances are used. So if we were to publish our own edition of Nikutai no Anarchism, I think we could produce a physical object with the money, but we couldn't sell it. Yeah.
Without much of a segue, why don't we just go to the questions? And at least so far in the chat, the first one at least that I saw was John's question about, this is the question, does the contemporary in contemporary art refer exclusively to post-war? What are the temporal parameters?
Yeah, that's a good question. I personally like to think of an expanded contemporary in the context of Japanese art. So for me, I teach a course at Gutai on sort of curatorial theory, and I have a kind of foundation lecture where I go back looking at alternate histories. And for me, basically everything from the Meiji Restoration onward is sort of a contemporary moment in Japan. But there is a very strong tendency to cut contemporary off with the end of World War II. And we had conversations about extending back into the Taisho period for some of the texts. And I think that is still open on some level, but it proved to be a little impractical, just that it was harder to find someone who could contribute recommendations for the themes that we had set up. And also, there are of course issues with language as well, where going into the early Taisho, late Meiji, or Meiji proper, the language is slightly different, and not the pool of translators who are usually working with contemporary are not necessarily versed in that kind of translation. But yeah, I think one of the texts we translated, for example, is Taki Koji's text on the birth of Goshin-e, is how we translated it. But that's a text which is looking at how the portrait of the Meiji emperor came to be an object of veneration. Right. So that's something where the text was published as a book in 1988, and we excerpted chapter 4 from the book. But that's essentially a contemporary text that is looking at Meiji, and so that right. Yeah. So that's one way we can kind of play with the timeline a bit, and we are definitely open to more of those texts. Another author that we are looking at is an artist called Shirakawa Yoshio, who has written extensively about the Taisho era avant-garde as a kind of key reference for his own practice. And so that's something I think the committee is still looking for an appropriate text of his to translate. But if we find one, that would probably be another way of connecting the pre-war period with the post-war period.
Is there also a distinction in the use of the word contemporary in terms of content? It tends to mean avant-garde or something along those lines. What about something which is temporally contemporary, but not viewed as particularly progressive, like contemporary Nihonga, which often, some of it can be very, very abstract and so on and so forth, but it tends to use the usual Nihonga materials. That's part of its thing, but it often doesn't get included when people talk about contemporary art. Does the purview of this site specifically refer to what's generally considered like avant-garde or experimental art?
Yeah, I think in practical terms, we're looking at art that sort of continues the lineage of modernism and avant-garde art. But I don't think we have to exclude other formats or other traditions, other fields, but I think our sympathies or our attention is sort of more focused on something that falls within sort of what, I don't know if orthodox is the right word, but what we associate with as a kind of post avant-garde artwork. But I think there are also a lot of emerging practices within contemporary art. So Takikoji is sort of predates that. He's one example of someone who's within a sort of contemporary art milieu who's looking at early photography. There's also a young artist / critic called Odawara Nodoka, who is basically doing a contemporary art practice, but one of her research projects has been looking at the sculptural representation of nude women in Tokyo and in urban Japan. So that's something where, although she herself in her own practice has a vocabulary of what we would recognize as contemporary art, she's looking at, just very monumental figurative sculpture. So I think, there are different intersections, and it's sort of finding the right, how do you say, finding the right text that could sort of bring those intersections to life, I think is important to us.
I see. Susan, bless you, you asked the $64 question that's on many of our minds. Is the project currently looking for more translators? Should interested SWET members contact you directly if they're interested in participating?
To be clear, I'm not volunteering. I am in no way qualified to be a translator for this project, but someone out there might be, editor or translator.
Yeah, there is. I think there definitely would be an interest in having more translators. There is an email address that I can share with people, which is sort of the general contact address for the translation project. Let me just pull it out of my email. Translation at bunka-artplatform.jp. So yeah, I think if anyone is interested in contributing, you could send an email to that address with some clips of previous work and a statement of interest, small CV, and I think that would be a really great. I think they would definitely appreciate it.
Would it be prying to ask who your successor is as the translations project director?
I don't know. And my understanding is that maybe there would not be an editorial director in the sense that I was doing it, where I was involved in basically checking every translation and guiding the translators and translation process, and I was also involved in the selection process, and so I had a pretty strong vision for where the translations needed to get to, and I think that going forward there might be less of that, strong interaction and sort of more focusing on the team aspect of having just each team sort of do its own thing. But I'm not sure where they would want to take it at this point. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Anybody, is there anything that we missed in the chat column? Any further follow-ups? If not, I guess we could end a little early, but Andrew, do you have any other things you'd like to add on to what you've said?
Yeah, I think yeah, this is a nice place to stop. I definitely I hope everyone gets a chance to check out the website and read the translations and share the translations with other people if you think it's worthwhile. And yeah, I encourage everyone, anyone who's interested, to contact the Bunka, the Jimukyoku, about contributing to the project.
Well, I just thought of just one last thing I wanted to touch on, which was the format that you put together for these articles. I liked the fact that there's a sidebar set up for the notes, and it struck me that there are certain things you can do when this sort of material is put online that is harder to do in a printed book. And I wondered, how did you come up, you collectively or individually come up with the format for displaying these articles?
Well, I think on a very low level, if you work with Microsoft Word and you use the comment feature, it's sort of already there, kind of subconsciously in our working environment. And what I do when I'm preparing translations is I like to, if I have something, if I see a passage where I know, okay, I'm going to want to put a footnote in there, I'll usually highlight it with the comment feature and I'll start typing up, a very rough note in the comment feature before then going back and finishing the note in a Word file. So that was one sort of thing pushing me towards that format. And then the other thing is that having, as I mentioned, having studied Chinese poetry and looked at sort of classical Chinese and classical Chinese texts, both in a Chinese context and in a Japanese context, I was always very intrigued by the kind of interlinearity of how classical Chinese texts are presented. So in some cases you would have a line of poetry, and then after the poetry you would have commentary on the poetry by not just one person, but potentially 2 or 3 people over several centuries, and then you would continue to the next line of poetry, and then so on. There are also texts where you would have the poem and then the commentary right next to the poem, if you're talking about a vertical format layout. So there is a nice use of marginal space and interlinear space in the East Asian publishing tradition that I wanted to that inspired me to propose having notes on the side. I've seen 1 or 2 publications, bilingual publications produced in Japan that also did it that way. So I don't think it's entirely rare. But one of the people I spoke with as I was preparing the style guide is a translator called Jordan Smith, who is teaching at one of the universities here, and he's also editor-in-chief of the, I think, Tokyo Poetry Journal is what it's called. And Jordan has this concept of what he calls translation 2.0, which is using the internet and online media to augment the translation, the potential of translation, even beyond what is possible with print formats. And so his idea was, you could basically do a sort of a translation with hyperlinks, for example. So rather than having a footnote on the side of the page or at the end note, you could maybe hover, put your cursor over a passage, and then the note would just appear on top of the screen, or you could link to images um, and maybe even more virtual reality style recreations of a physical exhibition space, as with the Yomi Uri Andapandan translation. I think in our translation with Bunkacho, we have one image of an installation view from 1963. But if you had this kind of translation 2.0 technology, you could maybe even create a sort of panorama view of one of the galleries at the Metropolitan Museum or something like that. So that there's still a lot more to explore in terms of pushing formats even further. Our translations are designed or laid out as PDFs, and they're put online as PDFs. So once they have been laid out, they're sort of, how do you say, they're rigid, or they're they're just as they are. So there's a lot more potential for interactivity if you had the support and the funding to pursue it.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like a great site, and there's certainly a lot to read on it. And well, thank you so much for the very thorough presentation. I think the fact that there aren't further questions is testimony to how thorough it was. Seriously, and
Yeah, really.
even I am out of questions. So thank you very much, Andrew. Really appreciate it.